Hi everyone, and welcome to today's IT Pro Web Seminar, How to Manage Today's Roaming Users, Removing Complexity from Identity Management, sponsored by Imanami. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the Help widget on your player console to receive assistance in solving common issues. And if at any time you're having audio difficulties or issues with advancing of the slides, simply hit your F5 key to refresh your webcast console. Today's web seminar is being recorded and will be available on demand for 12 months starting tomorrow. You'll receive an email when it is ready. And with that, let's meet today's speakers. Bill Clayman is the CTO at MTM Technologies and an enthusiastic technologist with experience in data center design, management, and deployment. His architecture work includes large virtualization and cloud deployments, as well as business network design and implementation. Jonathan Blackwell is a product manager and technology evangelist at Imanami Corporation. And with that, the floor is now yours, Bill.
Thank you so much, Jen. What an exciting topic. Guys, I hope everyone's just as excited as I am here, and I can't wait for Jonathan to come in just a little bit. We're talking about the capability to manage today's roaming users and remove complexity from identity management. And I really couldn't think of a better topic to talk about in today's day and age with all of the stuff that's happening with digital tools, people coming into the network. I mean, even myself within my own organization, I have one corporate ID that I know I actually have a couple of lab IDs that I have to work with. So I know that within our own Active Directory forest, there are a couple of Bill Claymans that are floating around. And, you know, the question becomes is, how is that managed? Well, what if I don't need one of those IDs anymore? And kind of what happens in the future as this stuff becomes a little bit more complex. But we'll get into that conversation in just a second. I can't wait for Jonathan to come in and talk about it a little bit more. But let me hang on just 1 second, take a deep breath, and level set just a little bit. We know that today's users are much different than ever before. And in this digitally enabled business, we know that users are always roaming. They're working from different locations. They're accessing and constantly requesting access to new applications and different kinds of services. And to that extent, managing access, identity, and even groups has become a lot more challenging. You know, we're working with contextual access to resources, new kinds of data points, workloads, and so much more. So the question becomes, as you grow, and as everybody listens on this webinar, how do you manage this? How do you effectively maintain distribution and security groups? And most of all, are you really leveraging greater levels of intelligence and even automation when it comes to managing user identities with platforms like Active Directory? Here's the big one. How are you simplifying management while still improving user security and experience? The challenges that we often find in-house networks with multiple applications and security points. And these systems, they're usually operating independently, where identity and access management is sort of done manually with minimal ecosystem integration. So what does this result in? An environment that's really incapable of handling multiple identities. It prevents them from being able to roam very effectively, and it creates a management nightmare, the spaghetti of identity as an organization tries to grow. Here is the other reality. We'll talk about it in a minute. Criminals love to exploit this stuff. So in our conversation today, it's going to be kind of important to talk about the current state of identity, working in a true mobile digital world, how identity is critical for productivity and mobility. We'll talk about working with AD, Active Directory, and simplifying management. We'll give you some final thoughts and best practices. Now, before I go on, everybody on this call, we've got a lot of great attendees. Please, by all means, go ahead and pop your questions or thoughts or comments into the Q&A session here, and we'll go ahead and get to that towards the very end. We will have some time to cover some thoughts. So if you're working with cloud or you're working with on-premise technologies and you've got an identity or identity management or Active Directory question with group IDs, please ask us about it. You're going to have a chance to cover it with some really cool experts that have been working in this field for a long time. So let's start this off. And I really feel like everyone should kind of pay attention to this one. We should pay attention to the whole thing, but this is definitely important as well. So when you work in the state of IT today, what are some questions you can ask your IT and admin and security staff when it comes to identity? And as you walk around your own offices, I'm hoping you guys are either smiling or maybe agreeing with some of this stuff as it maybe falls into your realm. So number one, what is posted on this monitor? Is it some passwords to financial applications? Is it maybe a phone message? Maybe is it a to-do list? And how often are we, coming around where somebody's got something hidden on their keyboard or posted on their monitor? Here's another one. What determines your employees' access? Do we give Alice whatever Wally has, or do we have roles, attributes, and requests, or really we give the employee access to whatever her manager says, regardless of policy or what the existing structure looks like? Here's question number 3. Who are your most privileged users in your enterprise? Is it your security admin? Is it for some reason your CFO? Or maybe it's a three-peat summer intern who's now left and working for your competitor. And here's the reality. Sometimes we don't even know they're gone, or we leave their accounts active even after these people leave. Question number 4, how secure is your identity data? Is it in 18 different secured stores? Maybe you protect the admin password and that's it. Privacy, what about privacy? We don't hold credit card numbers, so we don't have to really worry about that, which is absolutely not the case when it comes to managing identity. You are most certainly a target because, simply put, your data is a target. And finally, how much are manual compliance controls costing your organization? Maybe it's nothing. We don't have any new headcount. Otherwise, it's don't ask, or maybe it's don't know. Because the reality is, when you do auditing, when you do compliance, if you don't have a good handle on what your environment looks like, you're going to run into some challenges. And this is even more exemplified by living in today's digital world, everything that we're experiencing right now. And when you take a look at the state of security in enterprise, and this is coming from our consultancy experience, at MTM, working with a lot of different kinds of customers across every single vertical. And this is what we're seeing right now. As far as the state of security in the enterprise, especially when it comes to identity, I don't care what vertical you're in, healthcare, pharma, education, government, this is what we're seeing. First of all, it really is incomplete. We're seeing multiple point solutions from many vendors, right? Maybe it's management, maybe it's individual. We're seeing disparate technologies that don't really work together. So siloed operations, siloed methods of identity authentication, different groups even requesting services. Here's the other big one. It's complex. And this is something that we're seeing grow as a real challenge for a lot of organizations. And the other reality is this: if you are working with an environment and you're growing and you're maybe fluctuating users, please don't let that get complex. Again, we're seeing repeated point-to-point interactions, mostly manual operations where IT admins maybe have to script something or are constantly challenged with trying to deploy the most optimal solution. Here's the other one. They're non-compliant, difficult to enforce consistent set of policies. It's difficult to measure compliance with those policies that are sort of hodgepodge and, in a different kind of state. And the other reality is this, we've really come a really long way, and we really are pushing forward. I mean, take a look at this graph right here. I mean, look at how far we've actually gone. It's pretty crazy, right? We started off back in the day, right, in the pre-1980s, simple mainframe architecture. The ID environment was pretty straightforward and pretty easy. Then we got in client server, internet, B2E, B2B, business to customer, mobility, and as time goes on, we've seen that explosion of IDs continue to grow and certainly continue to become a lot more challenging. And please understand, this isn't going to get any less complicated. We're seeing this continue to evolve as organizations now leverage things like the edge, more distributed computing, more environments that are spread out throughout the country, for example, and certainly more services and more tools that are directly interacting with the underlying ecosystem. And that's really important to understand. So because of this explosion of IDs, we've really sort of ran into a bit of an issue, right? Where you're trying to manage this stuff a lot more intelligently in your enterprise directory, your Active Directory ecosystem. A big challenge becomes this identity chaos. Lots of users, lots of systems required to do business, multiple repositories of information management, multiple user IDs, multiple passwords, decentralized management, and ad hoc data sharing. Maybe it's not this bad for you. Maybe you only have one or two of these squiggly lines in your environment. But the reality is, as you grow and as you continue to evolve, managing this becomes a big challenge. And here's the other reality. We talked about this a little bit earlier. The pain points in trying to control this go in multiple different directions. First of all, you've got the IT admin, too many stores, user stores, too many accounts to try and manage that, and even too many admin requests. And you have things like unsafe scripts that are maybe potentially that an admin might write just to make their life a little bit easier. Then you might have redundant codes. For example, if a developer is trying to create something, they have multiple IDs, multiple places they have to enter in. They don't have a good structure they can work with. And then for the end user, it could be extremely complicated using different URLs, different group IDs, for example, where their Active Directory structure is just not properly formulated and they just can't get in their environment. And they get long waits for access to apps and resources, especially when Active Directory isn't properly managed. Now, I really think that security and compliance should be in a state of its own, mainly because if you have orphaned accounts, if you have limited auditing capabilities, I mean, user IDs, the identification of your own people, that's so important. And if it's complex and fragmented, you're not going to have security and compliance. And believe me, things like shoulder surfing, social engineering, for example, all of these are real threats to identity management, especially if someone can get in. Then finally, the business owner, the people that are responsible for bringing in revenue and making sure your business runs properly, there's a need for control, and sometimes it's too expensive for them to even reach out because their own business isn't running effectively. So we know that in this growing digital world, working with identity is absolutely critical for users, business, and productivity. And this is something, again, like I said, that we see across the entire industry. And when you get this right, when you do deploy proper tools, you simplify access, you increase speed at which employees can get access to their critical applications and resources, you make life easier, much easier. First of all, you become trusted and you create reliable security. I cannot stress this enough. The dynamic nature of today's environment and business community, the onboarding and offboarding of users requires this level of trusted and reliable security, especially when we're working with user IDs. Then you create efficient regulatory compliance. You can actually audit your stuff, see what's going on in your environment, and then be able to provide feedback to your organization, and not just, hey, who's logging in where, but also around licenses, working with various types of applications, and all of that results in lower administrative costs and development costs. And I was just mentioning that because once you gain control of your IDs, right, you're able to see which services you require, whether you're not, you might need additional servers for a specific kind of virtualization environment. The evolution of the ID is not just can you log in or out, what's your password, but these are really tied into management use cases, business use cases, and certainly tech use cases as well. Then you enable online business networks and you do create better end user experiences. When you have disparate, when you have dislocated and disjointed Active Directory trees, user access methodologies, you're going to run into some challenges. And here's the other reality. Logon times might take longer. You might be asking to load a group that might be having to scan multiple areas in your network. And the challenge there is this. You're not just trying to prevent an outage or potentially a breach. You're also trying to prevent latency and slowness. And in today's world, there's actually a really important term that we kind of toss around. Slow is the new down. And if your access methodology, specifically working with user IDs and identity, is slowing down the process, you're going to have bad user experiences. So when you do a good level of identity management, it creates not just value, but also simplicity. And obviously, it helps with end user experiences as well. So let's kind of dive into some of these more important tasks. And again, I can't wait for Jonathan to come in. He's going to be talking about the real world tools that actually make this possible in just a little bit. It's important to note what we're doing in the industry when we're working with Active Directory and simplifying management in general. And once again, guys, I see some questions coming in already in the Q&A. Again, I love an interactive crowd. So if you've got any questions, comments, or thoughts, by all means, go ahead and pop those in. And Jonathan and I are going to get to that in just a second. So you remember just a few slides ago, I put up this one image of the squiggly lines, right? So you remember this, right? All the fun squigglies and all that stuff. You've got HR systems, database systems, productivity, infrastructure apps, VMs, cloud applications, in-house apps, for example. Maybe you got a couple of those. And your enterprise directory is, everybody and their puppies in there, and you don't know who is what and what they're doing effectively. Well, the reality is this: when you simplify this level of management and identity management specifically, and you have a good level of management integration into your ecosystem, you will make management easier, not just for the users, but for authentication, authorization, identity data, and all of those other kinds of applications you see there on the right. I really can't stress this enough. Even if you're a small organization and growing, or if you're a large enterprise, it's time to review your own identity management practices, especially when it comes to Active Directory and working with specific kinds of user groups. There are ways to make this kind of environment fundamentally easier, much more easy to control, and much more easy to, let's say, provision and deprovision your users. So in these kinds of environments, you have to be able to work by identifying your users, know what they're effectively trying to do, and so on. Kind of backing up a little bit, you see those applications on the right: HR systems, database systems, productivity applications, and so on. You have to remember that it's developers, it's people accessing VMs. When you look at your own domain and Active Directory architecture, maybe you're looking it up right now in your domain controller. I don't know. That's really some impressive multitasking. Don't click on anything. We don't want you to break anything. But again, to that extent, are there too many users in there? Do you have multiple accounts and user identities for people that are in labs or different forests or sub-forests within your Active Directory domain? How well are you managing those groups? And again, if you're an organization that sees an influx of users coming in or out, we're seeing this in healthcare, education, certainly the services industry, things like leisure, online. We see influxes happen all the time, and these organizations have to proactively include identity management to make their life easier. And the reality here is this: when you do this kind of deployment and you do a good identity management architecture, you will make your life easier, again, across the board. And there's two ways to look at this. And again, I'm excited to pass this off to Jonathan in just a second. He's going to go over some of the tools that can do this. But again, the reality is that there's big benefits for users, admins, and of course the business. But as opposed to just looking at this tactically, look at this from a strategic perspective. So I mean like IT as well as business. So when you take a look at the benefits tactical today, save on money and improve operational efficiency, you're going to improve time to deliver applications and services. You are absolutely going to increase and improve your security methodology, and you're going to be able to include things like compliance, regulation, and auditing. Those are immediate benefits. Like right now, you're able to leverage this kind of stuff. You gain control of your user environment, their IDs, their Active Directory ecosystem, and you're able to leverage this right now. Now, if you're talking to the executives or your management team, and you need to simplify this and talk about it, there are strategic benefits to creating an ID architecture, a user ID management architecture as well. First of all, you're going to figure out some new ways of working. Being able to access applications, use sort of digital services, working with cloud technologies, being able to integrate various types of services much more seamlessly, because you're not going to have to go through your AD or your enterprise directory and make sure that things are aligned. You don't have to clean stuff up. There's no orphaned users. That one user doesn't have rights to another group that might not necessarily need to be there. So all of a sudden, you do have that new ways of working. Improved time to market. Now, yeah, absolutely. We're talking about identity management and group and AD and ID management. And absolutely, you can leverage things like improved time to market because you can get products out faster. You can do test and dev faster. You can integrate applications and have your users do things like proof of concepts, for example, and you can deprovision and provision user IDs as you require. If that stuff takes longer, you're simply going to have to wait on your products to go to market or before a new solution is capable to impact your services industry. But when your users are able to log in or off, your developers are able to access identity as they need to, it makes that life much easier. Then finally, closer supplier, customer, partner, and employee relationships. Because oftentimes you've got maybe a portal, a user needs to log in. Maybe they're not a part of your organization, but they're certainly a part of your identity. Because they're accessing a piece of your environment. And if it's convoluted or complicated, your partners, your suppliers, your customers might have a real issue getting in, or worse yet, they might get access to stuff that they're not supposed to. So in this kind of idea and concept, working with our IDs and our own persona in Active Directory is far and beyond just, your username, your password, and what group do you belong to. There are so many additional benefits that can go above and beyond that kind of framework. But again, I don't want to get too far into this. I really want to dive into the kinds of tools that make this level of efficiency, especially with IDs, much more possible than maybe some organizations have today. So really, without any further ado, and again, guys, questions, we'll get to those towards the end. It's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Blackwell to talk about the actual tools that make Active Directory group management fundamentally easier and much easier to work with from an organizational perspective. So, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for the great introduction and the foundation that you've laid here in terms of discussing some of the problems that organizations have. So I'm going to kind of narrow down all the problems you've had and kind of wrap them up with some best practices and solutions to help solve some of these known problems. It's interesting that a lot of these things that you discussed might be kind of understood under the covers, but really aren't addressed because they're frequently ignored. And that's because typically groups aren't managed. And groups is foundational. It's what organizations use to make identities useful. Because you can have an identity, but unless that identity, that credential that is given to an individual is granted access to something, it's basically worthless. And rather than give individuals access, we've kind of wrapped our organizations around granting access through groups, which makes sense because groups are an easier way to work with multiple people at once. But memberships change in groups frequently for onboarding. Typically someone comes to a new organization, new department, or new to the company. They ask for access, but changes occur. Their job role changes, their project changes, et cetera. And so the question you might want to ask yourself is, as these change, does it reflect your current role? In other words, does your membership in groups, does it match what you're doing? And when we talk to our potential clients about this particular question, the answer almost is always no, because very infrequently do people ever say, please remove me from access to XYZ, because it doesn't impact their productivity. The only time they really get noisy is when they need access to something and they get granted that access. So there's very, very infrequently is there someone that's actively saying, please take these keys away from me. So that's something you want to have to think about. It's not managed. First of all, do your users notify? How do those changes occur? A lot of times it's the user, it might be their manager, it might be the HR department. Perhaps, you add people to new groups only, and the groups are from that point forward are pretty static. Those are the kind of things that happen. And then, of course, probably the other way that people will implement this is through some form of delegation. And in fact, we'll talk about that in greater detail in the future. And sadly, a lot of organizations don't have any type of policy or any type of procedure in which to manage changes in groups. They might just create new groups, assign new access, and kind of like fire and forget, and that's a ticking time bomb in terms of security when that group remains there. So what is our answer to that? Well, really you should need to build groups with membership intelligence. And this is, when we talk about membership, we're talking about those unique identities that are created for those new people. And that is, using the knowledge that we have. So what do I mean by intelligence? Well, we know the people in our organization. We have, we can describe them. We can tell what department they're in. We know who their managers are. We know what their job title is. They might have a job code associated with them. There's information that we have about the people that work in our companies. What can we do to leverage that information? Does that information exist in an HR platform? Does it exist, in our heads? Does it exist in the directory? That information is out there, but it's leveraging that intelligence to determine membership in groups. So there's a couple of different ways that we could do this. First of all, people, especially technical people, might be familiar with LDAP queries, but frequently those are too complex for most, especially if the query is going to be very sophisticated for using more than a few attributes. There are other sources of information as well. As I mentioned, it could be an HR system, a CRM platform, some database. How can I use all this information together to determine what they should have access to? In other words, can I leverage information that exists in the directory, that exists in the HR platform, that exists in a database, that exists in a project database, for example, and how are all of these things going to tell me what entitlements that they should have? And more importantly, when those things change, can it impact and influence what rights and permissions that we give them as a result of those changes? Can I remove their access when they've gone on to a different role? And so that's what we need to kind of narrow our focus on. And so once your logic is sound, once you have an idea of what it is that you're going to do with that information, then we can make some strategic choices. So, for example, is to use a query-based group. In other words, to use a sophisticated group membership designer. Instead of naming 150 employees for a group, instead I use that information, the information about like what department they work in, what city they are in, and perhaps what value exists in a database for that particular identity, and combine that information together to create a profile, essentially a role, because a role is, after all, a collection of attributes that describe somebody, and then to use that to determine membership in a group. So instead of having a group that grants permissions to resources based on some list that somebody gives me, I've now based it on intelligence that I've gathered, and automatically the membership is populated accordingly. And the great thing about this is that I'm doing this just once. Unless the business need changes, I can use software to change those needs. But as people move on to other roles, they're removed from the access that particular group grants them access to, would grant access to. And that's strategically important. And that's much better than using an LDAP query. If you can read this, kudos to you, but I guarantee you that even the most technical people would have to look up, what syntax, how to write an LDAP query, pulling in all the different values, looking at the bitwise attributes, for example, and determining for a particular attribute that uses, bit values to try to determine, which ones I need to select, for example, can be challenging. Much easier to use a designer. The next thing we need to talk about is how we give somebody access to resources when really they're only temporary contributors. A lot of times there are projects for which groups are created but are rarely meant to be used perpetually. And even those groups, they have changing contributors because they are only temporarily involved in a particular project. So what do we do to resolve that? Well, one way is we use that intelligence that we spoke of before. And that is to determine that their rights are based on their role. But, projects that are, they're rarely perpetual. And quite often they have temporary contributors. And sometimes those contributors might not be reflected in their attributes. So how do we go about that? One of those ways is to enact what we call temporary membership. That is to, when we go about the process of automating the adding and removing of users into groups, that we do so more than based on intelligence, we also do based on time. And that's important because when we put time locks on access to certain things, then we're guaranteed that that particular permission and that opening in the window in terms of security for that particular access has an end date, that it doesn't live on forever. Let's go on with it. So temporary membership are for those type of scenarios where membership is based outside of the logic that we built into a query. And so a query might, for example, be based on a role. Let's say, okay, this person is here, but they really are, they're really only a temporary contributor. They're going to be here working with me for a month to get this project off the ground, and then they're going to go on and do the next thing. So temporary membership should be above and beyond role-based query logic. And it ensures that there is ongoing trust in the membership. Significantly, because you'll be assured even those users you add implicitly to a group can be done so on a temporary basis, regardless of the criteria you might have used. Now, groups themselves should never outlive their business purpose. As one of the things that we found when speaking with organizations over the last decade is that, and this probably is true for most of those listening here, is that there have been either you yourself or someone in your organization, maybe your predecessor, has created a group for a particular business purpose, and that business purpose doesn't even exist anymore. And that group, there's a little bit of fear, right, in terms of deleting that group, because you certainly don't want to break a business process. And you're not even sure what that group is used for. It might have a weird name to it. And because there isn't frequently clear documentation, the membership isn't really well known, maybe there's no established owner, that group just sits in your directory and on and on and on. And maybe you in the future or a future you might use that group. It might have a familiar name to something that you think it's being used for, and then you repurpose it for another task, and now you run the risk of someone getting access and a member being added for the true owner of that group, manipulating that membership, and then all of a sudden, someone has access to a resource they really shouldn't have. Groups should never outlive their purpose. And so in the process of creating a group, we really need to put the shackles on that group in terms of its life. Even if it's a perpetual group, we should have ongoing attestation as to its validity. And that validity includes, not just the group itself, but everything that group circles around, especially the membership. And with that process, by putting a business stakeholder responsible for a group, it can live on in perpetuity, but done so with oversight. So every single group that's created should have a life cycle policy attached to it. Okay, another thing we want to talk about is this concept of nesting. And groups are awesome. They're great. They're a great productivity booster for an IT worker because you can do management of users in bulk and mass. Who wants to assign access to a file share or to a printer to individual people? We don't do that. We assign them to a group, and that group might reflect a department or something of that nature. And then sometimes we want to inherit permissions that are part of another group. So we nest one group inside of another. Great architecture. It's a great idea that that capability is there. But there are inherent problems with that, and that is because nested groups, what we call parent-child groups, may not always reflect your organization. So we really need to understand how your organization is structured before you start doing those type of things. It's important to understand the intention. We recommend that your groups reflect really the structural aspects of your organization, whether you intend to use nested groups for security or a distribution list or both. It should reflect the way your organization operates. Once you've determined how your organization is already structured, you would determine the attributes that properly reflect that structure. If you don't have anything appropriate, you should consider leveraging tools, and we have tools like this, that would help populate your directory with the relevant information. The groups have, when they're nested, have a familial relationship between them. And as they're properly established, this parent-child relationship also determines an inheritance in terms of permission. For example, if you were to use a geographical consideration for a nested group, you might consider the country to be the parent of the state, or the state to be the parent of a province or a city, et cetera, et cetera. The level of nesting and the complexity is limited only by your imagination and your business. But I've seen people use nested groups as many as, and leveraging attributes to determine that type of nesting, as many as 10 to 15 attributes deep. But that can be very complex. If you're doing this manually, I send out prayers for you, because it becomes very, very cumbersome, and it can quickly become a security nightmare if you don't have some type of automation surrounding this, because you can accidentally nest a group with, with very good intentions within another, and a parent group somewhere up in the line is granting access to a resource that really the people in the group that you're nesting shouldn't be a part of. And if you don't have an overall plan and strategy in place, then it could be a recipe for disaster. So some of the ways that you can look at, a proper way to nest groups is to look as really based on how you view your organization. And I'm not saying that one way is the right way or the one way is better, or I'm not necessarily making a recommendation for you at this time, but I think it's important for you to internally look at, how do we see ourselves? Do we look at ourselves as geographical units where we separate each other based on location? Maybe we view ourselves more along the lines of who works for whom. Maybe you're looking at something from more of a departmental point of view, or maybe it's multiple, but maybe it's a hybrid of those type of things. Well, if you wanted to nest group, we recommend that you have that nesting reflect the way that you view your organization. And that makes it a lot easier for you to delegate management resources to those types of nested groups. And it's a very clear type of delegation. Now, one of the things we want to avoid is scripting to do these type of things. It's a common way to tackle these issues. Maybe you have or maybe you haven't written any scripts, but I recommend not bothering with that. A purpose-built tool will do a much better job. It's no offense meant to the scripters who are on this call. It will just be quicker and easier to manage and adjust with the changing businesses. The more complex the script gets, the more true this is. Here are the challenges our customers say they face when using scripting. And maybe this applies to you. All right. We do not. Every time a new project is started, a new script is written, and unless you have specific knowledge of the particular project, then the next script writer may not understand the code. It becomes cumbersome to manage. And if you're trying to tie this into external applications, an ERP platform, a database, et cetera, more than just what the directory provides, it becomes very cumbersome. And so we recommend purpose-built tools, especially in terms of the speed of delivery. Scripting really is a Band-Aid problem, and it's not a problem that should be programmed. So as an example, if you wanted to create a distribution group through scripting, this is what it would look like if you wanted to create one. And I'm telling you that if you did this for hundreds of groups or even thousands of groups, it becomes very cumbersome. If you have to manage the code for these and if business changes, you have to go into all the code and make those kinds of changes. It's much better to use a UI-driven tool that will do this for you. The next thing that we should really discuss about in terms of tackling these issues is to delegate membership control. Now, it usually ends up being a three-way kind of management process in most organizations. You have someone who owns the resource, you have the person who needs access to the resource, and you got the IT person in the middle or on top, or however you want to look at it. And it starts several ways. The one who owns the resource says, I want to give you access, so he calls the IT person and says, please give so-and-so access. They are now the bottleneck. The person who wants access calls IT and says, I need access. IT person says, calls the resource owner. One of those two is the bottleneck. Perhaps the person who needs access calls the resource manager themselves and says, hey, I need access. And the resource manager says, let me call IT to get you access. Again, one of those is a bottleneck. Really, the best way to ease the burden is to get out of the way. And that is if somebody is really responsible for saying, yes, go ahead and add this person or please add this person, then just give them access, give them control. But we don't want to give them true IT level administrative access. We want to give them, some form of delegated control that gives us as the IT worker some leverage of oversight and control. And that is, grant them the ability to manipulate membership in a security group or a distribution list and do this with some level of oversight, either with a workflow approval request or some kind of notification, but give those people the control. And then allow the end users to request access themselves as well. give them the ability to opt in and opt out. And then also delegate, especially for those groups that you have properly put into a life cycle policy, give them the ability to renew those groups that might expire. And by doing so, you really are pulling yourself as a technology worker out of it, because really what you're doing, if all you're doing is adding and removing people from groups, you're a highly skilled, highly trained data entry person, and that's not what we want to be. And we can do this. We can delegate as much as we want from the product. We can delegate complete membership control. We can even delegate building a query. You see here in the screenshot is an example of someone who's been delegated the ability to manipulate a group's membership through a query. It can be as simple as just adding and removing users by themselves. So, in summary, let's talk about some best practices and some of our recommendations, kind of re-highlight some of the things we've been discussing. First, groups should always have intelligent membership. We know that information. We have access to that data, and we should leverage it. And then when we leverage it in an automated way. So rather than using the intelligence put into our brain and then going out and being that data entry person, instead build an intelligent group, what we call a smart group, leverage that information, and then members are automatically added and automatically removed from that point forward based on that intelligence that we've gathered. Delegate the group management to your business stakeholders. These are the people who, if you're an IT worker, you're constantly referring to and asking, is it okay if I put this person in this group? Put them in charge and use a web-based portal tool that gives them the ability to do these things, but retain as much oversight as you want. So if you still want to have the final say, put a workflow rule in there that says I want the final checkoff to be me, and then to do this by assigning ownership to groups, and even and then taking those groups that really don't have an owner and either assigning them an owner or deleting the group. Because if a group doesn't have an owner, if there's not a business, if there's not somebody who is responsible for that group, it's probably not a group that's necessary. So you have to do one of two things. One is decide there's an owner and assign it, or this group really, isn't really useful anymore and expire it. Okay. The next thing to do is that we recommend is to allow your users to opt in and opt out of groups. Now, some groups, like maybe the Book of the Month Club or the Book Reading Club or maybe the Walk Around the Business Park Club, whatever those could be, maybe free, free-forming groups where people can opt in and opt out at will without any type of approval. Perhaps other types of groups, however, you want to allow people to opt in but have a stakeholder, be their responsible party for approving those tasks. But you notice I mentioned when I said this, I'm not involving IT in any of these things. Sure, IT will have the final say if they want, but you can cut the cord completely and allow people to be productive on their own and take yourself out of the loop. The next best practice is to enact temporary membership, and this is really important for static groups where users are perhaps only temporary contributors, and that's the ability when someone opts in, opts out, or manually added to a group that you specify a start and end date. And not just temporary inclusion in a group, but there are good cases for temporary exclusion from a group as well. Frequently in some companies they send out daily notices about what's happening around the building, and and then somebody's going out on parental leave, let's say, or maternity leave or something of that sort, and they're going to be gone, or they're not gone on sabbatical, they're going to be gone for 3 months. They don't need to hear the daily news that's in the office, and they don't need their mailbox filled up. Maybe a temporary leave would be appropriate. And of course, with temporary join, any type of temporary membership, the temporary leave policy would be useful as well and should be used. Another best practice is to self-validate accounts. And one of the things that Bill spoke about is this influx of identities. We get them all over the place, and because there are so many of them and we're so disconnected, especially if our organizations grow large or if we're in disparate locations, I don't know every individual, but it's important that each identity be validated. Hopefully we have some kind of mechanism through an HR system, but even in there, people are, for example, are hired or they're provisioned in the directory before they're actually an HR entity. How can we go about ensuring that there isn't an identity that sneaks in there, or that the reporting structure is incorrect, or that the attributes associated with an account are accurate? By compelling users to regularly validate their own accounts and that of their direct reports, we ensure that there's the accuracy in the directory. And again, that actually benefits things like the intelligent groups, because now I can leverage all those informations that I've compelled on my users to validate against. A good example would be, hey, validate your mobile phone number, because we need to be able to get a hold of people after hours in an emergency. And by compelling them to validate that regularly, then I always have that up to date. And so, that's the end. I would love to get any questions that the audience might have, and I know that you have some instructions on how to do that if you don't see that right now, and we can open up the Q&A.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, like you said, let's go ahead and get started with questions. So first question, as a security analyst who makes these types of recommendations to the server team that makes changes in the AD, what is the best way to get them to take your advice to make these changes?
Okay. Well, one of the things is that, everyone's overtaxed, overworked. There are a couple of different reasons why people would deploy, new policies, new products, et cetera, and that's either to improve efficiency, increase productivity, or to reduce a burden of some sort. In these type of scenarios, the things that I've described today really answer all of those things. They really, increase productivity because people are provisioned quickly when you have intelligent-based membership in groups. When you hire new people or transfer someone from a department, they're immediately provisioned. You don't have to go to IT to do that. The burden in IT group is lightened. I can't imagine that as from a security perspective alone, it's pretty simple. It's like, hey, you ask somebody the question: is it possible that any group in your environment has a member in that group where they really they shouldn't be anymore? That's wrong. And very rarely can anybody honestly answer that and say, no, everything is perfect, because people by nature just they don't ask to be removed. They move on to a new role. They don't say take me out of X, Y, and Z. They don't think about it. And so what happens is that a well-tenured employee ends up with this giant. If you imagine that each membership in a group, or each everything they have access to is represented by a key. Someone who's been with the company for a long time ends up with this huge giant keychain, and they don't know it, and it's not malicious or anything, but they become a potential vector. So as a security analyst, you could say those people are the risk, not them as individuals, but their credentials. And by implementing something that wraps some policies and requirements around their group membership, then we're mitigating a lot of those issues.
And just to add to that a little bit, Jonathan, you bring up some really good points. The question was, as a security analyst who makes these types of recommendations to the server team, what can you do to, give better advice, or how can you actually make these changes possible? I mean, obviously from a security perspective, there's a lot of implications as far as getting identity down right. I mean, there's no question about that. But when you're working with different kinds of business units, focus on the simplicity element of it, how you're making their life easier, and other IT administrators as well, that their life is going to be easier as well, because they won't have rolled accounts. They'll be easier managed. Users are going to be able to get their infrastructure a little bit more easily. And asking the simple question of, if we don't have control of our user IDs right now, how are we going to regain control of that later as this digital influx continues to grow? So, I mean, that was a really great question. I mean, as a security analyst, you probably completely understand the ramifications of a poorly controlled, user ID, group ID ecosystem. But beyond obviously scaring the crap out of your other your IT admins or your employees, focus on the benefits, the positives of getting an IT environment down properly, and what it can do for a business.
Okay, great. Next question. Is there a best practice one could use around public networks?
Oh, that's a good question. It really applies to if you have a public directory, or when we're talking about identities and group membership, really we're talking about the enterprise primarily because it's something that we're focused in. But this applies on any type of these policies or these best practices can apply to any type of network that might exist, whether it's an enterprise or it's being used in a B2C type environment. There are sometimes large directories that exist with identities for individual for customers, for example, and the same type of practice, especially if you want if someone's entitled to access to a specific type of application within a service, how is that access granted? It's typically going to be membership or subscription of some sort. And one of the benefits of a product like Group ID, when we're talking about primarily about Active Directory, is that multiple types of identity stores can be leveraged. And if you think about a group is nothing more than a list or a subscription to something. And managing those lists is something that that Group ID can do as well. And what we recommend is being used. So I hope that answers the question with respect to your public networks.
Right, and just kind of adding some thought to that, aside from managing, who gets access to where, how group IDs are assigned, remember that people coming in from, let's say, the outside, there's a lot of great ways to do contextual access. Who are you? Where are you coming in from? What kind of data are you trying to get to? Querying and interrogating the user, their device potentially. If they're coming in from a public network in Starbucks, you will be able to integrate with things like Group ID to be able to, give them proper amounts of access based on the context of their network and where they're coming in from. But, you can't get to that point unless you have a good management ecosystem to begin with internally. But remember, right now, it's all about contextual access, especially if you're coming in from externally inbound. But there's a lot of really good ways to manage that. And again, you're not trying to deprecate the user experience. That's the other thing. These kinds of tools specifically act to still allow users to get access to the information they need, but obviously doing it appropriately so.
Okay, great. Can a group manager create a new user, or can that only be done before adding to any group?
That's a good question. Now, what you empower, what you delegate a user to do is entirely based on your own company requirements. So, for example, there are some clients that will use a product like ours that would empower stakeholders to manipulate and manage their own groups that have already been created. In other words, they don't have an ability to create groups. They don't have an ability to create users. They just can add and remove existing users, perhaps approve them. But they might have another another type of role within the organization with slightly elevated permissions, and that might be maybe it's a site administrator or like or a departmental IT, and they're granted a little bit more rights. They can create groups, but again, they can't create users. And then there might be yet another role where users can be created, and they can be internal users, external users, etc. And that might be assigned to an IT department if you wanted to further delegate IT or the help desk or HR, for example. Really, it's based on your specific needs. So if you want to empower your users to create, or your employees or staff to be able to create user objects, both internal and external, create contacts, create groups, and manipulate the membership of those groups, you want that much access. It's entirely up to you as deployer, and you have that kind of fine-grained control where you can identify what people can do what types of things. That's the beauty of delegation in a granular way, is that the user experience is consistent, but what they're exposed to access it matches your own policies, your own needs.
Okay, great. And to kind of piggyback off of that question, can we define the max number of users in a group?
There are those possibilities. So we have this thing we would call I can't remember the name. It's a maximum size of a group in terms of the group proper, but where you might have more users. Let's say, for example, there's a limitation on synchronizing one group with another identity store. You can specify a limit on the size, and if you have a need to add more users, it will automatically create a child group and nest that group within, so the effect is the same. You can also we also have the ability to create reports. So if you wanted to limit the scope of a group, or you wanted to report on group membership size, you can get that as well. But there isn't a policy in the Group ID product that limits the total number. So if you wanted to stop, for example, especially if you have an automated group, you wanted to prevent anything greater than 5,000 members in a particular group, there isn't a trigger that does that, but you can get reports on that, so you can act on it.
Okay, great. Next question. With the amount of new connections coming into our business, it feels like our AD and identity management is pretty complicated. What can organizations do to clean it up a bit, and what are some design thoughts moving forward?
Well, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Oh, no, go. You want to go and take this one, Jonathan?
Oh, no, go ahead, Bill. It seemed like you had a pretty good idea how to answer that.
Well, first of all, the obvious answer is it's not going to slow down, especially if you are developing new applications, if you're leveraging things like cloud, if you're, distributing your environments. The best piece of advice I can give you, obviously your Active Directory is at the heart of your organization, right? That's how your users get in and how you identify them, how you create your forests and get access to various types of resources. It's not going to get any easier if you don't manage it now. That's kind of the bottom line. And believe it or not, we're working on a lot of projects today where, a big part of it is before we launch any application, a new business unit, a new product or service, we sit down and we take a look at how these users are being managed, the Active Directory architecture, and really where there are just gross inefficiencies because there's just minimal levels of control. These amounts of connections aren't going to stop, and I completely understand where AD and identity management can become, kind of like a bowl of cooked spaghetti. But again, what you can do today is literally start with tools like this that help automate the process, that help clean up the kind of architecture, that help identify group IDs and give you more simplified access. There are a lot of things you can do to make that kind of environment easier. The bottom line is, whether you're having a lot of connections coming in right now or it's going to happen down the line, just get control of it today. Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
Oh, sorry about that. I think you kind of hit it on the head. And one of the things that organizations are getting more complex. There are a lot of services that exist in lots of different places, and so it appears that there's going to that there are multiple sources of truth in terms of identities. But the best that we could do is continue to kind of unify all of the identities and to unify the experience for our users. One of the things that's very, very important, and sometimes that people forget, is there is this idea that as we explore and take advantage of new cloud-based services that leverage both an on-premise identity or an identity in the cloud, is that if those identities and membership in terms of groups that they're in, if they aren't accurate, if they aren't true, if they don't reflect the reality and the business needs, well, all we're doing is we're taking, pardon my language, our crap that's in one spot and throwing it into another spot. And so we really need to, before, now is the time to kind of tackle making sure that we have only those identities that are necessary. We have only that all their attributes are up to date, that they're constantly validated, and that the group memberships are correct. So that as we continue to grow as an organization, as we continue to consume more resources that leverage these identities, that we're starting from something that's clean, as opposed to just taking stuff from our dirty laundry from one place to another.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time today, but I'd like to thank Imanami for sponsoring today's event, along with Bill and Jonathan for their great discussion. Just a reminder, this seminar will be available on demand starting tomorrow, so please feel free to come back and review. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for attending.